So our goal today
Mhm.
is to ultimately not have a Beavis and Butthead moment, or have, I would say, a no more than two.
I give it
But
20 seconds.
yeah, before we go, okay.
All right. Welcome back to your favorite podcast, Native Tongues, where we speak with writers and musicians about where they call home and how that place influenced their voice. I'm your host, Aaron Palmer, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Ken Hall. If you like what you're hearing, please hit follow, rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, and check us out on Instagram at Native Tongues Pod. Now, we've got an interesting guest this week. Originally from London and now living in Atlanta, this man came to speak to us on a topic that I feel passionate about. He holds a PhD in history, he's lectured at King's College, an honorary research fellow at the University of Queensland. He's published opinion pieces for CNN and Time Magazine, he's appeared on CNN and ABC News, as well as numerous conferences and panels discussing the topics that he's written about. He is the author of the books Soul of Doubt and The Dangerous God. His newest book, One Nation Under Guns, How Gun Culture Distorts Our History and Threatens Our Democracy, is the piece that he came to talk to us about today. It's a really interesting, objective perspective from somebody outside of our country who is now experiencing it for the first time. He's a delight to talk to and was able to educate us on a number of topics. Let's welcome to the pod, Dominic Erdozain.
Even as I'm speaking, there's a house being built there that it's actually called Sherwood Forest, but it's being deforested by the day.
Right.
I mean, literally all the old canopy is coming down. And so I planted a lot of trees myself, and that's been one of my kind of passions.
Yeah,
nice.
But nobody, there's an organization called Trees Atlanta. One of the most amazing things about Atlanta, they will come to and plant trees for free. They'll plant up to three per year. And we go around knocking on doors saying, "Do you want a free tree?" And people are like, "Nah, probably not." So it's very odd.
Seems like a lot of work. I don't know.
I mean, they'll come and plant it for you.
Yeah.
And it's really strange, actually, because we do live, I mean, not to sort of jump into the theme straight away, but
Yeah.
we do live in like a sort of, Rus in Urbe. It is a kind of the country in the city.
Yeah.
But people are just not interested in, even the gardening club, which I'm a member of.
Privacy or fresh air.
Most people are not interested in actually planting things and growing themselves. They want to go on tours of nice gardens or go on trips. It's really weird.
Right.
Anyway.
The sense of self. It's funny. We live in a community that has lots of tulip poplars, which are prone to drop limbs. So I'm just
Tell me about it.
Massive limbs. And one of our neighbors had this beautiful old big tree, but man, it just had it out for our neighbor. I mean, twice it's almost hit him, like literally his person dropped a branch on him.
It's terrifying. Yeah, we've got a huge one at the back and it drops limbs the whole time. And it looks beautiful, but I didn't realize when we moved the different kind of hierarchy of tree kind of structures and stability, but it's a real worry. We had to put a lightning kind of rod on it just to sort of
Did you really?
add an extra layer of protection, because it's one of the tallest trees in the neighborhood, but they're messy trees.
Well, we got it. We compromised, and I was reluctant as I was, because part of the reason we loved our house when we moved in was because of the trees around it. But we did remove the tree yesterday.
Yeah.
So yesterday we had a crane. They had to bring a crane in and
Oh, really?
do all
So
kinds of
recently,
stuff. Yeah, it was yesterday.
Yeah.
So my deck right now is covered in sawdust and all that stuff too.
So you live in Atlanta. You've been there for a while?
Yes, we moved in 2012. My wife's a kind of senior editor executive at CNN, CNN International.
Oh.
And I was at the time working at King's College London as a fairly lowly lecturer, and feeling that I didn't have any time for research. I was heavy teaching load, big amount of administration. And I did get a year's fellowship a year's buyout of my teaching for my book, The Soul of Doubt. But I didn't feel that I could really be a scholar, ironically, in a tenured position in London at a good university. And then obviously being married, and there's a sort of trade-off of, different people's careers, and she was offered a huge job in Atlanta. And so we made the decision in a matter of minutes. It was like, yeah, we're off. Didn't perhaps count the cost. So we moved in 2012. I think that, yeah.
Yeah, Atlanta's a pricey city.
Well, not that. I mean, it's, on that side of it, as a sort of outdoor person, I loved, compared to being in London, suddenly I've got access to green spaces, whatever, but
Oh, yeah.
just the cost of like the culture shock, really, and just the sort of what it's like moving to a place where, we had governors passing guns everywhere, laws within a couple of years of us arriving.
I think you're supposed to come through the north first. Like you're supposed to live in the north if you're coming from England. That way you get a little bit of culture, but still some of the same ethos. And then
like
you
dipping
could
your toe in the water.
Yeah, you got to like season first, and then you're ready.
I think the difference is probably greater. I don't know. I mean, I think the difference is probably greater between New England and Georgia than between, say, New England and London. But I mean, I have a friend moving up to Connecticut from here, and everyone up there is like, oh, you must be so glad to get out of, this backwater, this kind of, sort of cultural wasteland. And she's sort of quite proud of Georgia, or at least of Atlanta. So Atlanta's a great city in many ways, but I had not understood the differences, and particularly the gun thing. I mean, that was the thing that just sort of captivated me, really.
Oh yeah, you threw yourself like to the fire.
I was gonna say, is that what inspired you? Or is that just coming over here, or did you already have some of those sort of like inklings?
It did. I mean, inspired came later. It was shock to begin with. I mean, I quote this quite often, that Samuel Johnson's quip about, travel invariably narrows the mind. We have this idea that we broaden ourselves by traveling abroad, but actually your first instinct is to cling to what you know. So to begin with, it's just a kind of culture shock and kind of get me out of here, after Sandy Hook, and then Bob Costas. I don't know if you remember this incident where during a NFL game, just to say, after Jovan Belcher, Kansas Chiefs player, shot himself and his girlfriend, and he sort of gave this spiel and said, look, we're supposed to talk about how these put the game in perspective, but if we want a real perspective, we should just think, if that young man didn't have a gun, he and his beautiful girlfriend would be alive. And it seemed like quite a profound, simple statement. And he was kind of pilloried from many quarters, and people calling for his resignation. And he eventually offered some sort of apology. And that actually hit me almost as much as Sandy Hook, just because of the sheer incongruity of it, that people
that he had to apologize.
So offended. But he had to apologize, but people were really offended. There was a statement that he's launched an attack on law-abiding citizens. And it's like, he didn't say anything about law-abiding citizens.
No.
And this kind of honor culture. So that was a kind of first thing, and it sort of built. And then, being inspired was more kind of when I started reading and thinking, is this stuff hardwired into the American experience? Is it built into the Constitution? And I thought, no. And then I wrote a book about it. But to begin with, it was just more of a sense of shock, and how have people adjusted to this on the left and the right, the sort of tolerance.
Yes. Yeah, very much so. As I was reading your book, and that's funny that you said the law-abiding citizen. So, it opens up with that first, the myth of the law-abiding citizen. That was an interesting point. But as I was reading it, I was thinking about you're right, the culture shock, that guns are such an inherent part of our culture that, take myself, for example. So I don't really like to watch sports. I don't like to go to strip clubs. I don't like to shoot guns. So by all standards in American society, I should have my so-called man card taken away, because, those are all the things that really make you a man, that make you tough. And, it's what you easily fit in and can talk about with other guys. But, there's plenty of other things I do that you would think line up to that. I support a family. I work out every day. I listen to punk rock and metal music, like all these things that are also kind of, hard and tough. But like, at what point did our culture shift and define these? I mean, I don't want to throw sports in there because sports are sports, but the other things that are like these like kind of scummy activities that are like, what makes you a guy, like people hang their hat on it. And it's not just in the sense that they're joking about it. It's like, you're right. People feel attacked when you come after these things. They feel like you're taking something away from them, that they won't be called a man or whatever.
it's interesting how recent some of this stuff is. I think that there's a really interesting discussion in that book on white rural rage by, is it Paul Waldman, and I forget the other author, and he's talking about the evolution of pickup trucks and the size of their beds. They used to have these long beds, small cabins, so that you can actually carry things.
Well, now they're luxury cars.
Oh, exactly, yeah. And now they're sort of massive air conditioned and with the tiny bed, and you can't get anything in them. And I just thought that was funny that there's a sort of evolution of it, and that people don't perceive that it's actually a bit unmanly, perhaps, to have something where you can't do those jobs or those roles that you used to do. I feel like for me, it just seems so recent. When I started looking into, the carrying concealed weapons, the people I know who have these licenses, and again, we don't need the licenses now. That seemed a new thing when we arrived, concealed carry laws, and
Right.
then within 4 or 5 years, that became obsolete, and now it's permitless. So it seemed to be this accelerating thing, but there was association of masculinity with these weapons that were so new. That confused me. But on the masculine side, this is where I feel like there's some hope for change, because I feel like some of the best conversations I've had with people are people who I've got to know through the outdoor stuff, planting trees, doing lawn stuff, doing kind of like, it seems, without betraying too many confidences, one of my friends who I referenced in the book has now moved away, who is a gun owner, but also we were passionate about equipment and tools and sort of, doing our lawns and stuff. And another who I'm friends with now, who lives in the neighborhood, who's our security officer, who is a multiple gun owner, but we've really bonded over the other stuff. So I feel like the association of masculinity with guns is a problematic one. And I think that, I feel like there's some sort of grounds for, for dialogue and at least sort of friendship that can kind of transcend the politics a little bit there. But yeah, it's I just wasn't convinced by the idea of, when you say it's inherent to who we are, it seems like there's a very rapid evolution of the kind of guns that people own now and what they use them for.
Yeah, I saw a talk we were talking about the idea of the revolver, like that. I guess when they first came out after the war, the Indian War, right? I think it was. They said they weren't going to have a market for them.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's something. There's someone's dug out correspondence of Samuel Colt and him writing, almost sort of moaning to shareholders that there's going to be no market for this new great invention. And after the suppression of the Seminoles in Florida, they're literally, without war, without the Civil War, and without the racial culture of the South, there just wouldn't have been a market for it. So it's this. I mean, this is, I don't know how much you want to get into the court stuff, but the bizarre thing about the Bruin ruling of 2022, which has extended this individual right to bear arms that was established in 2008 in Heller, it's extended it to people carrying weapons outside their homes, and people writing editorials in Hawaii saying, save us from the tyranny of guns, because this is completely alien to our culture. But the irony of the Bruin thing is saying that there can't be any restrictions that weren't there in the early republic. But as a friend of mine who teaches at Berkeley, Brian DeLay, points out, many of these weapons simply hadn't been invented. So you don't have repeating rifles, you don't have revolvers.
Right.
So why would there be laws? And in fact, many of the practices that are now enabled were illegal under common law. So you've got these statutes that go all the way back to like the 14th century. You might have heard of this, the Statute of Northampton, 1300s.
No, we're both kind of dummies. We're nowhere near as smart as you.
But this is kind of, this stuff was in practice. It was still active in most US states until new laws were written in the 1830s and 40s. There were still old common law prohibitions against going armed. So what the Supreme Court's now saying is that there has to be an active, positive law written in that period. But first of all, most of these weapons hadn't been invented, and they certainly weren't current. And secondly, there already were like common law restrictions. So anyway, it's complicated, but we have a bizarre anachronism now that what was normal for most of the 19th and 20th century is now unconstitutional. When people like Ann Richards in Texas is vetoing this first concealed carry law, I think in 94, 95. She's horrified by it. She said it's going to turn us into a state of vigilantes.
Yeah, sure.
So it's fairly recent.
Yeah. I mean, that logic is like, we don't need driver's license or that because the founding fathers didn't expressly say anything about cars.
Exactly. It literally is. Yeah, precisely.
That doesn't make sense.
Yeah. And the idea of, the self-regulation for good guys with guns and bad guys with guns, like you said in your book, how, everyone defines himself as one class or another. What did you call them? Like the sheep, the something,
the
the wolves?
the sheepdogs and the wolves.
Yeah. Sheepdogs and the wolves. Right.
So go on, yeah.
I was just going to say that, trying to classify ourselves saying like a good guy with a gun is the safe one. It's the bad guy with the gun who, skews the data and he ruins it for all of us. But who is determining who the bad guy with the gun is until he commits an act? And then if you take it a step back further, the good guy with the gun, the people who want these concealed carry licenses or, just permitless ability to carry guns on them at all times. I can't imagine myself in a situation where I would be forced to take someone's life. It's horrifying to me. I don't want that guilt. I don't want the repercussions. So people that, you're right, do have that vigilante sense of justice, think of themselves like Dirty Harry. If you're carrying a gun on you, you're expecting to use it, right?
Or you should be prepared to.
I mean, it's kind of like a sociopathic tendency to be out there wanting to be able to use it.
Because I'm a dummy. What's the sheepdog?
So that's analogy. The idea that all of society can really be divided between the bad guys, the wolves, and this is actually an elitist idea of those who would do the training to be concealed gun carriers, where they would see themselves as the sheepdogs protecting the sheep more generally, so that they're kind of superior because they're taking responsibility for the sheep who are just sort of like normal citizens. So there is an elitist quality there, but I think with gun culture generally, that doesn't always have that tribe, that sort of 3-tier approach. It tends to be just the good guys and the bad guys. I did a talk or rather a panel at Davidson, and one of the academics there was very much, look, we had two pro-gun people, one person who was a kind of gun control person, but who was a gun owner who was representing Moms Demand Action, and it was me. I was the only non-gun owner on the panel. And one of the academics introducing us said, well, of course, there are millions of gun owners in America, and very, very few of them misuse their weapons. So, can't we just ease up? I suppose it's that attitude. What you're saying, Aaron, is exactly how I feel, and that this early psychology of these guys I was looking at in the 1960s, like Hans Tock and Rollo May, who would much more firmly make that connection between like the gun is itself an act of aggression. To have it, you've got to be thinking that you're willing to kill. And I read this stuff and I think, I'm no better than these people, truly. I mean, I lose my temper. I have all sorts of flaws that would make me not want to own a gun. And so on one level, I feel a kind of human solidarity with the people I'm writing at. But the point of difference, the cultural difference, is that idea that I'd be willing to take a life. You look in the First World War, the YMCA got heavily involved in training people and recruiting people for the war. And I was reading these manuals about how you've got to train people out of this reluctance to kill. And they're talking in the most, to me, kind of bizarre and incongruous language of imagining Christ leaning over this Gatling gun.
Oh my God, is it really?
And it really is disturbing, but they're working so hard because it's not natural. I mean, there are all sorts of psychologists saying it's not natural to want to kill people, you don't know. That my friend who was doing a PhD at Duke on these concealed weapon carriers, and we were laughing about how the research is already obsolete because it's all about training people to meet the requirements to get the permits, and now they don't need to do it, and presumably a lot of these people will be out of business. But he was saying this Christian gun instructor was saying he doesn't go to his mailbox without strapping on his weapon.
Oh my God!
Out of fear of the apocalypse,
someone might come up behind him, but he thinks he's being strong and responsible. But to me, that's not living in freedom. But the thought of using mortal force, it's mind-boggling. So yeah,
isn't that living in fear though? Like, I don't want, do you want to live in a space where it's like, I don't know, like I put on shoes because I'm afraid when I walk outside, I'm going to step on something. Right. But like, if you're treating your gun like that, where you're like, I better have this because you don't know what I'm going to come across.
Yeah, I think it's living in fear. I mean, it's a bit like all this stuff we now know about how technology owns us, our smartphones and social media and all this stuff that you go back to Marx in his economic and social manuscripts in the 1840s, he was saying that, technology will become our fetters. And then I don't know if you've come across like Jacques Ellul, who's a sort of French writer who talked about how modern technology is going to own us. There was an interview with Jodie Foster after she made that movie, The Brave One, I think about 10 years ago, where most people would see that as a straight up vigilante movie, which it probably was. She was defending it in an interview saying, no, this is all about how someone is basically remolded and remade by the technology, by the lethal technology, until she becomes an instrument of the tool. And I don't know whether reviewers would agree with that. And but I think that that's maybe the positive side of some of the conversations I've had with just maybe 2 gun owners or 3 that I know here. And it's difficult because it's an awkward thing to broach, but it's like, do you really want that thing in your home? Someone who owns a Glock handgun, I said, do you really want that potential and that risk? And so I don't think it's freedom in any way, shape, or form.
Do they know your position just on a personal level? Like when you go to have this conversation, like, can you stand around the barbecue?
Yeah, I think this is a great thing. And I talk a lot about American patriotism, but one is a sort of given a free pass as a Brit. I mean, there's no question that you can say things that you wouldn't be able to say.
I was going to ask about that at some point, to be like, and then at some point, when does Earl look at you and go, well, you wouldn't know because you're, not even American? Or
I mean, it flips pretty quickly. I mean, one of these guys I'm still very fond of, and we get on well, but after a drink or two, it'll be sort of, you're just an ideological visitor to our country, he'll say to me. So
like, I'm
actually here. I'm not just an ideological visitor, I'm here.
Right.
And now I could say to him, I am actually a citizen as well. So, but with him, it can be pretty testy because, he's a lawyer. He owns an assault weapon, and I will, say things like, so what is the Second Amendment? And I'll challenge him and he'll splutter out bits of it.
Part of it.
Exactly. And then you realize you can only say that once. The second time, it's almost a friendship breaker. So I relish those conversations, but I do come up against the limits because it's just, you're still John, what we call back home Johnny Foreigner, you're still the outsider. And although you get the free pass, I think it's quickly you're cut off.
Well, you did come from England, so he needs to have his well-formed militia because you could storm into his house at any time.
Yeah,
right. Exactly.
Exactly.
But it's like your comfort keyboard, what you were talking about earlier, and our addiction to advices.
Yeah.
It has to become that, right? Like it's their comfort weapon. Like if he's not leaving the house without it, it's just so strange to me. And I apologize, you don't look like the kind of person who does this, but the people who strap cell phones to their belts,
right?
I feel like it's just as dorky looking.
Well, that's a key word. I mean, I was doing a discussion yesterday with a group from Wisconsin, a kind of gun violence prevention group, and we were talking about cultural ways, and that word dorky, I mean, I was quoting Oscar Wilde and saying that, if you call war evil or wicked, you'll never remove its charm, because some people like that. A lot of people are kind of entranced by that. But if you call it vulgar, and certainly to Brits, like vulgar is like a complete sort of turn off, then that's the way forward. And I've been thinking that as soon as it becomes uncool, and soon it becomes deeply, not even barbarous, just, I mean, dorky's a good word.
Look at that dork with the gun. That's how you get shot.
I mean, it's a fine line between insulting, but I was racking my brains for things that, like, positive examples. I think of some of my heroes, like, Dorothy Day and her whole kind of, I'm not going to cooperate in nuclear fallout drills because I'm just not going to honor the presence of nuclear weapons by even going through this ritual. And I like that because it's just sort of, I'm not buying into it on any level. But I was thinking about, I don't know if you remember, Gregory Peck, and,
of course,
my favorite, he plays this, has this kind of restrained, urbane, kind of dignified
stoic
masculinity, in To Kill a Mockingbird, which he just plays the part to perfection. The other one is The Big Country, which is my favorite Western, where he's, oddly enough, his protagonist or his antagonist is Charlton Heston, who's this kind of gunslinging young Turk.
Oh, God. Yeah.
And without giving away the story, Gregory Peck plays this sort of Eastern dude who will not fire his gun. He's ex-military. he knows what weapons can do, and he won't get involved in these feuds, and he won't be drawn into fighting duels. It's just an amazing sort of example of manliness, that, like a non-violent masculinity. So anyway,
I'm assuming at the end the happy ending is that he shoots somebody and kills them, and Charlton Heston cheers, and there's a parade, and he's come around.
Well, no, I mean, you've got to watch it. You've got to watch it. But unfortunately, the New York Times review of the time said, yeah, it's great. It's cinematically absolutely, it's stunning. It's visually one of the most impressive Westerns, perhaps. But it says at the end of the day, fighting is more exciting.
Yeah, right. Well, I was going to say, in a way, it's like, there's this sort of culture around the Western, you know what I mean? And now if you're bringing in this philosophical argument to it, like I said, and not having seen the movie, obviously, but like, that's an interesting thing. I could see people not being what they came to see, so to speak.
Yeah, I think it won a couple of Oscars. I mean, I think it was, but I don't know too many other examples. I mean, there's some James Stewart.
The Searchers?
What's The Searcher? What's that one?
But
it's just a visually spectacular film that's kind of long and trotting, but just a great watch. But it's not action heavy.
It's not action heavy, but there is still redemptive violence. There is still kind of scalpings, and I don't know. I think some people say that's the greatest of the Westerns. It kind of left me a bit cold, but the Big Countries are the clearest sort of full critique. The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance is another ambiguous one, maybe in the category of The Searchers. But I don't know if there are any modern examples. And I do get a bit frustrated with these actors who come out and make strong statements about gun control, but their art and their product is in a way highly affirmative.
Yeah, especially right now with the vigilante trend. Everyone wants to make the next John Wick.
It's all Die Hard on a whatever, kind of idea.
Yeah, but to a lesser degree, I mean, Die Hard is like a policeman who is thrown into a bad situation. Most of these are like somebody who has, left that world behind and goes into hiding, and nobody knows like what a badass they are and how many guns they keep in the house.
Right.
And that is just
exactly.
Yeah, it's so glorified.
Going back to your notion about changing the view of it, the only thing I was thinking about when you were talking about that was like the Truth campaign and smoking, among kids, where, they did a whole big sort of guerrilla thing, when we were, I guess, I don't know if we were growing up, I don't know if that was 90s or 2000s really even, but not saying, smoking kills you. They did lots of stunt things like that were about how smoking, you look like an idiot when you smoke. And, this is like all the rat poison and stuff like that. But they really did try to make a culture shift around smoking, as opposed to just saying smoking is bad, don't do it.
Well, now they put those pictures of like cancer-ridden lungs on boxes of cigarettes. They should just put like really gruesome dead bodies, like murder scenes on
gun boxes,
the sides of guns.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think there is an argument for that. And I was talking to a woman in Rhode Island who was working for one of the gun safety organizations, and her we were saying that really we need to see the images. We still have this immensely sanitized view, and we hear the numbers, we talk about thoughts and prayers. At least that's the discourse, and we don't actually see any of it. And Twitter got in trouble for posting some graphic images a while back, but we're saying until we actually see these redacted images, like Newtown, the Sandy Hook shooting, I'm sure you're aware of this, it required DNA evidence to identify some of the victims, and some of the descriptions, I feel I can't even do it now, is to describe some of the effects. But of course, all those images were redacted, and the hoax, when someone claimed to have been a nurse helping victims, they were exposed as a liar because she'd said, "Oh yeah, to see those children's faces," because actually their faces were not visible. So anyway, I put it to this activist that we need to see these images, and her reaction was pretty firm. Those victims, those families already had enough, and why should the burden fall on them?
Sure.
Anti-war activist in the First World War is discussed in Adam Hochschild's book, The War to End All Wars. And a peace activist who spent a year in prison and then came out and became a prison activist. And she said that no judge should be able to sentence anyone to a custodial sentence to time in prison without at least spending a week inside and seeing the conditions and knowing what you're dealing with. And I think that if our legislators or people actually voting on these things, these glib conversations that they have in the Senate, if people actually could see the effect I think it might do something. Because, you often have these mass shootings and people who voted against gun control for years say, now I get it, but why should it take it happen in our own community for people to
Right.
understand?
But it still only moves at, fractions of an inch, where you say this is the one that's going to end it all. And we're going to close the loopholes. But then, it goes away. The gun industry just has so much presence and so much power. And, they're essentially a hobbyist club like the NRA,
Yeah.
no different than like baseball card collectors, except they can kill people with their things
hobby.
that they're collecting.
That should be one of the things, like, to
Yeah.
get a license for a gun. I know that, like, we talked about the licenses thing, but that should be like when you go to get your driver's license, you have to, go and sit in America at least, and you have to do the blood runs right on the highway video about driver safety and why you don't do it. And, there's like all these ridiculous
Right.
videos about car crashes, and this is why you don't drive drunk, and they make you sit through that. Like, there should be something like that. Be like, all right, well, here, if you're going to buy this gun, just so you know, this is how they've been used in the past. Don't do this. You know what I mean? And show people the horror where it actually goes, and so they see it.
But I think even then, this is the cultural difference. I don't know whether we are just so down on our sense of national pride, although of course we've had this kind of revival of nationalism that led to kind of Brexit and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
But I just don't know people, and I know people who are just as kind of flawed and have just all these other kind of vices that you might think of, but I just don't know anyone who would really have that confidence. Like you're saying, you being prepared to kill. That the people who buy a gun, a friend of mine during COVID was worried about alleged crime spikes in our neighborhood, and really, I wasn't aware of it myself, but screeching cars at night, whatever. I'm going to get a gun, and I was quoting statistics that you're kind of more than 40 times more likely to use it on a member of your family than you are against an intruder, and this imagined intruder really is just not going to happen. And the guy has two pretty vicious dogs as well. But when I said, look, you're more likely to use it on a family member, it's like this look of shock and its idea of, investment, the fact that past performance doesn't dictate future
returns.
Yeah. I find that kind of fantasy, if that's the word, or that kind of.
Yeah, it definitely is.
How do we chip away at that?
I don't know. It's tough because, you're not just thinking about yourself. Even if you say you're a responsible gun owner, how many other people are living in your house that are not responsible gun owners? And then, those people will say, well, but I keep my gun locked up in a safe, which how long does it take to get into your safe if somebody's breaking into your house? So it becomes irrelevant. And on top of that, a gun in any situation, like you said before, is an act of aggression, just the presence of it. So if somebody breaks into your house and you pull a baseball bat out to scare them, 99% of people are not going to stick around to find out like if you're going to swing it or not. But if you pull out a gun, you're immediately escalating the situation, and so that person needs to defend themselves in some way.
Yeah.
Yes,
well,
I agree.
The baseball bat doesn't have the range that the gun has either.
That's how hard you can throw it.
If somebody pulls out a baseball bat, you can turn and run. If somebody pulls a gun on you, I think my natural thing would be to freeze. I'm going to stand there stock still and be like, I don't know how to process right now. I haven't been breaking into houses very much recently though, so I haven't come across it. I'll let you know. Let you know how that comes out when I get in the moment. But I think there is that idea of the fantasy of I have this because when I need it, I need to protect my family and I need to do this, and the world is crazy. I don't have the statistics in front of me, but you just said, 40% more likely to use it on your own family.
No, more than 40 times, like many, many hundreds of percent.
Oh God.
More likely.
Jeez, 40 times more likely. Sorry.
Yeah.
But like, and what are the chances of home invasions and even things like that you are protecting your family from? It's a weird thing too. I actually heard a commercial the other day for firearms, and they were saying when seconds count, the police will be there in minutes. Get a gun, like that was their argument. And I'm like, you can't be like, trust law enforcement on one side of it and the police are there for you and all that, and then be like, here, get a gun because the police aren't going to be there when you need them to be,
Yeah.
That to me was like a weird argument too.
Yeah, I think the statistics show how when someone does pull a gun, how often they're actually shot. Because if you're an armed intruder, then you're more likely to use a weapon if someone's threatened to shoot you. The practical arguments that you were suggesting, like with the safe, etc. If you're fast asleep, whether you're actually going to be able to wake up and be an effective kind of defender of your your home is unlikely. But the study that was done in Atlanta by Arthur Kellerman, when he was at the CDC, he found that in 300 cases, most of the shootings were family. Only 2 of them had been shooting intruders, and then in one of the cases, the homeowner had actually been shot by the intruder, the person who produced a gun. And this is the same that's true of, the NRA said that women should be armed to protect themselves against rapists and violent partners. Even when they do arm themselves, they're more likely to be shot because it's a physical thing to get the gun and to fire it. And so there's a kind of,
in a state of panic too.
Absurd. Yeah.
And you're also introducing the gun. Now you've brought the gun into the situation.
Yeah.
So whether the person that was attacking you was ever going to use a gun, if they see you have a gun and they have a chance to get your gun, better to hold the gun than not.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the crazy things about the Heller decision, Supreme Court decision in 2008, and Antonin Scalia was literally writing in phrases, could have been written by the gun lobby, probably were in some cases, some rather odd spelling errors and oddities in his footnotes that would suggest kind of copy and paste. But at one point, he's talking about a defenseless homeowner being able to point a handgun at an intruder with one hand and dial the police with the other. And this is where Kellerman, who's a social scientist and a physician, he wrote this scathing report saying, "Dream on, Scalia." This image of the heroic young lady. It's just not going to work like that.
Right.
Intruders just don't wait patiently while you call the police. But
Right.
it's just the idea that we've got justices, writing like this without expertise. I mean, that's not their area of knowledge.
Right. Right.
So anyway, his was the report that resulted in Congress banning research at the CDC on gun violence, and that's one of the big lows for me doing this research, just to see that Congress can not only do nothing, it can actually ban or at least defund research into the problem.
Which is crazy because you're saying, the people like the Supreme Court, for example, are not the qualified experts on this, and they don't rely on the qualified experts at this. But, they're the ones who make the decisions. It's bizarre. I don't know why we take any of their baseless theories seriously.
Yeah, except that they have been able to overturn, handgun bans, in DC, and that now seems like such old news because, now they're authorizing handguns anywhere out in public, and including places historically like Hawaii that they just don't have that tradition. And
what was the basis for the Heller? What was Scalia's point?
Well, I had a whole chapter on this, and as late as the 50s and 60s, we have a constitutional amendment that refers to the right of the people to keep and bear arms, in a well-regulated militia and for the security of a state. For 200 years, that's understood to be a military thing, and you're obviously under the authority of officers, and it's to defend the state, and it's kind of part of the army in times of war. Part of the national army is going to be. So that's well established, but as late as the 50s and 60s, you've got NRA lobbyists going and doing research on it, coming back and saying there's nothing really there. It's a state right, it's not an individual right. That's how the courts have decided. So it's kind of well established. But what happens really with the Reagan era is that it accelerates as part of a culture war, and you get these kind of wacky scholars. Gary Wills writes this scathing review in the 90s, about these wacky scholars that think it's an individual right. And what they do is kind of use dictionary entries to break up the sentence and say, what's an arm? An arm's a gun. What's to bear? It means to carry. What does keep mean? It means to possess, rather than seeing it as military language to keep and bear arms, which researchers have shown that in 98% of cases imply military usage. So anyway, I call it death by dictionary because they play around with dictionary entries. In one case, one absurd case, someone took a dictionary entry that referred to the right to bearing arms in a coat. Now, scholars have pointed out that this is referring to a coat of arms. So you bear arms in your family coat of arms, heraldry. I've got a
this is my shield.
Yeah, arms on a coat. So this is taken to mean by some of these wacky scholars, and I won't mention them by name, to mean that you would carry a pistol in a coat. But we talked about how revolvers weren't invented then. You had dueling pistols, which were big and quite pointy, but that was not the meaning. But Gary Wills wrote this review, I think in 95 in the New York Review of Books, and it's like this joshing, scathing, kind of mocking tone. And I read that now with just cringing and horror because, of course, these same scholars will be cited and were cited by Scalia
God.
in 2008, where he reads the thing the wrong way round. He takes the arms bit first, and then he comes to the militia at the end, and he says the militia is not really a militia; it's a sort of pool of people who could just be summoned spontaneously. It is
Right.
outrageous.
Wow.
Yeah.
And that was the turning point.
I mean, I can say because nobody's going to ask me about it. But so I feel like you just got to be on the take at that point, right? Like you're just manipulating things like that. And like you said, the thing, I did see the thing about the typo in the way that it was referred to in the footnotes. And then there turns out that was actually like in an NRA, like
Yeah, so
pamphlet
this
or
is the thing.
something.
This really got me personally because I found this case, State v. Hundley, North Carolina, and this guy is denied the right to carry a gun out of the home, and the judge says, look, because you have a right to bear arms for the state, all the more guilty are you for abusing that that ownership of a weapon for the protection of the state, of the service, and the militia. All the more guilty are you for abusing that for personal reasons and terrorizing people. And he says, and what's more, may we never come to the point in this peaceful state where it's ordinary and acceptable for a man to carry a gun as part of his manly accoutrements. So I read this and I'm kind of buzzing, thinking, why has no one quoted this? So I'm searching through my notes and finding it's not there. Then I find that a similar one is there in the Scalia's majority opinion in Heller, but with a different spelling. It's clearly the same case because it's North Carolina and it's the same year and it's everything else about it. But he's misrepresenting it. So I Google the misspelling and his exact page references, and it takes me straight to the NRA website and a brief submitted by georgiacarry.org. So I go to my initiation ceremony, and it's in kind of bleak days of COVID. You can't have guests, and the whole thing was downbeat. I'm thinking, do people know that their federal law is being written, constitutional law is being written by the gun lobby, or what seems to be?
Yeah,
it's that bad.
That's crazy. What year was the case, the North Carolina case?
1843. But it's the case that they do lean on positively is a case from this state, Georgia, 1846, which is, so what happens is the southern states have much more of a vigorous gun culture, particularly the deep south. I mean, North Carolina, much less so, Tennessee, less so, but particularly Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama. And people who move from the northern southern states to those places comment on the ubiquity of guns. Anyway, even in these heavily gunned states, when people appeal against convictions, appeal to the Constitution, they're usually slapped down. Judges, even in the South, are saying, no, this is a militia thing. It's not a personal thing. It has nothing to do with the rights of personal self-defense. With one exception, in Georgia in 1846, there's a case by this notorious jurist called Joseph Henry Lumpkin, who's a flamboyant slave owner, white supremacist. He's always quoting from the apocalyptic passages of the Bible and talking about curses of Ham and the stain of Nessus, and basically a vicious racist, even by the standards of the South. And he upholds the individual right to bear arms for the first time in 1846 and says blacks will never be able to carry guns because they're an inferior race. Now, this is the case that's quoted by Scalia.
He clearly hadn't been to Baltimore.
Right.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is the case that becomes the benchmark for Scalia in
That's what they rely
in the
on.
Supreme Court ruling. And the following 2 years later, in 2010, they overturn a handgun ban in Chicago, and again they're quoting this guy Lumpkin, who's a kind of comical, notorious figure in the South. And that's where you think we're in a parallel universe here, because the jurisprudence of slavery is now writing our gun law.
Right. Yeah. Oh my God. I didn't know that.
I just saw they overturned that bump stock ban.
Yes.
Also, for
I wrote a piece on
reason?
that on CNN, which, I mean, I always get some nasty correspondence, but this was the nastiest I've had in response. But again, it's this method of dictionary. It's a legalistic, it's kind of, we're quoting dictionaries that say this is what a trigger is, in case you didn't know. And the argument is that even though a bump stock makes a gun behave like a machine gun, it's not in its intrinsic essence an actual machine gun
Oh
because
my
the
God.
trigger's moving very, very rapidly,
Right. So it's not actually
albeit
on.
mechanized by the pressure of the bump stock. So you don't move your finger fast, it just makes it go fast. And that was enough for the majority to say it's not a machine gun.
Oh my God.
So did people say to you, murder is not enough? I have a right to mass murder?
Seriously.
Yeah, I mean, there was a cartoon just saying that, oh, so in future, it's good to know that if you are shot down by one of these devices, it wasn't technically a machine gun. I mean, it's a
Right,
sort
no.
of Byzantine
Right.
subtlety.
Well, isn't that like a philosophical thing where you can like judge something by its intrinsic value or the result of it? Like at some point, doesn't that make more sense to look at it and say, if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, it's probably a duck and move
Yeah,
on?
yeah, that's exactly it. That was the Sotomayor's argument in the dissent. This is to all intents and purposes a machine gun, but it's the overweening textualism which ignores the actual content of the statement. And here was a kind of rare bipartisan moment. Trump came out and said, "This is outrageous. We should ban these." And the NRA went to visit him in the White House and talked him off a ledge, talked him off the more radical steps he wanted to take. But this is where I do see some hope, because if you go back to Trump's first book when he was thinking of running as an independent, he's lambasting the Republican Party at the time for being slavish followers of the NRA. He's clearly not really a gun guy. He's certainly not a hunting person, doesn't really know anything. He's not interested in the technicalities. He used to get his sons out on stage at the NRA convention as if to say, here's a real gun.
Yeah, look at my boys.
But he is a money guy that likes attention.
Yeah, but it's confected. There was that Washington Post article a year or so ago about the AR-15 and just saying, quoting one of the libertarian sort of kind of guru figures, I forget his name, and he was saying that no one really needed an assault rifle, but it was a good way of saying F you to the left.
Right.
Sure. There is this sort of
absolutely
short-term politicized, and I think it's obnoxious.
Yeah, there's no proper use for an assault rifle.
I also see some grounds for hope there that it's so recent that I think that could flip quite quickly. I've been reading a lot recently on individualism and groupthink. This is what I find so ironic about the NRA and about the sort of people who send me abusive messages. They all have the same phrases: I'm a leftist, I'm this, that, and the other. And there is just a formula. There is a kind of, even though it's an escalating culture that is claiming more rights by the year, it is very much a monochrome. The arguments haven't changed much since the 1920s and 30s. It's not a place of great independence of thought. I think if leaders on the right, even if it's Trump, could bring some alternative perspective or could ease up or say no to the NRA if the NRA dissolved and it's in trouble, I think change could come. I mean, I don't think the money, you mentioned the money, Aaron, compared to, there's a really good book by Matthew Lacombe, political scientist, compared to big pharma, compared to the arms industry as in, the military contracts.
Yeah.
I think the gun lobby per se, it represents a very, very small amount of the lobbying.
Yeah, it's just weird that the stronghold they have, though.
It's not an elephant. It's achievable to sort of remove that.
In theory, I just don't think it's the money. I think it's become a political orthodoxy. But even as I say, the fundamental arguments haven't changed. I think the claims are so new that it should be reversible. I don't know what you think about that.
I mean, we're talking about a constitution that was written hundreds of years ago for a different time in a different language that we're allowed to make amendments on, but I don't know why this isn't revisited often, every 50 years even.
Yeah, but I'm just sort of thinking culturally that, if a generation of, I think what really distresses me is when you see young people advocating, or even using assault weapons, and you think about the Kyle Rittenhouse case, where you see people who,
God, that sniveling little shit.
Because and thinking it's the heritage that the flack I get is for writing these articles and saying this is not the American heritage. It's like a postmodern phenomenon that's really started with Reagan, but even then it wasn't. Most of these practices were not normal until this century. Even since I've been living here, the escalation. I found an article written in 2016 bemoaning the fact there had been 270 mass shootings in 2015, and we've already passed that this year. It's more than doubled in 5 or 6 years. And the number of road rage incidents has gone up by 400% in 5 or 6 years. And every index, we haven't had the big mass shootings, but the number of,
Mhm.
of shootings involving 3 or 4 more people has doubled in 5 years. So yeah, that's the point at which I begin to despair. But I think that if young conservatives could see that this is pseudo conservatism.
Yeah, and an individual think versus the group think is what needs to come into it, because right now it seems like if you are leaning right, you need to be all in on every part of it, or you are a rhino.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. Yeah. See, that's where I think to challenge it and to find a sense of excitement and wonder. And I read these books, people like MLK, or, I finish with that quote from Nietzsche. Nietzsche saying this: someone's got to break the sword. At the end of the day, you're not fully human. If you're sleeping next to your sword, okay, it's an analogy, and it's literalist age. People say, oh, it's not a gun.
Right.
Mhm.
But to appeal to a sense of masculinity, a sense of kind of, you're just not really a human being. Obviously
Right.
that's polemical and that's going to offend people, but to appeal to almost the romanticism of breaking out of that.
Hmm.
But maybe if the Trump thing is such an utter disaster for the Republican Party, and it causes I'm ambivalent with Trump, because on the one hand, he shows some of the absurdities of the right, the fact that he doesn't talk about thoughts and prayers, he just says, get over it. And there's something almost
Right.
refreshing about that candor, as well as something repulsive. So on the one hand, I think he represents a kind of escalation that could cause young conservatives to think enough. On the other hand, he also represents that kind of postmodern thing I'm talking about, where it's all a bit confected and we're making it up as we go along, and we'll say it because it
Right.
gets votes, but we can unsay it pretty
Yes.
quickly if we want to.
Well, it's like selling a Bible, like he's not a religious guy. He's
Yeah.
not
Right.
Oh, did you see his
know?
quote in the last 24 hours about this morning
No.
about the Louisiana thing? He thinks it's a great thing. It's going to be the thing to revive
Oh my
Christianity. It's like,
God.
do you really mean this? I mean,
No.
No,
No,
there's no evidence of him
no.
ever in his history, being a devout
He's
Christian.
like, yes, that sounds great. That sounds great. Yes, good.
But that's weird, the religious part that's been pulled into it, like the
Evangelicals.
yeah, that fall behind him. I mean, they've got to see through it,
Do they want to, though?
there's a whole theology there about Cyrus. Have you heard this? The idea of Cyrus, the pagan king who protected Israel, and God uses. So there's a sort of, there are prophets. There are people who claim to have prophesied his rise, and then when it happens,
Oh
it
my
becomes the
God.
proof. So okay, it must be
Yeah.
God. So there's that side of it. But then there's this narrative of the pagan leader who God uses. So, but also, I was talking to someone the other day saying that the sexual transgressions and the kind of roguish element appeals to the sense of grace, like David in the Old Testament, who has the affair and then kills the husband and tries to cover it up. And there's almost a kind of charm in that. But I think it's just the degree of culture war. I've been going through Molly Ivans' correspondence. Every of you remember her, the brilliant columnist in the 90s, early 2000s. And she wrote boldly about guns. And she goes, every time I write about guns, people threaten to kill me. So I was looking through, and she kept these letters, and I've been reading through a lot of them. And so many of them were written by Christians. And these threats and people saying things like, Christians don't need gun control. Of course, because we're the good guys. And it's like Franklin Graham, Billy Graham's son, saying,
Sure.
God has already done a background check on all of us. Well, does that mean all of us?
Right. Everybody? Because you got baptized? Didn't know that was part of it.
I'm Jewish, so am I the outlier? Am I the wolf
you are
in
the
this situation?
Outlier, yes. The background check they ran on me before I was baptized, I was, not a lot of references. My past was squeaky clean.
Squeaky. Oh my goodness. It's very interesting you mentioned the Jewish thing, because there was a documentary called The Armor of Light with an evangelical pro-life minister and Lucy McBath, who lost her son, Jordan Davis, in the shooting in 2012 in a gas station in Florida, which was by an NRA member, Michael Dunn, who was subsequently found guilty, having initially been exonerated. It's a really fascinating documentary. But Rob Schenck, the minister, says, I've almost had to rediscover my Jewish roots in making this case, because I think evangelicals are so much, we're saved by grace alone, by faith alone, that there is there's almost like a suppression of the ethical demands and the idea of the sanctity of life. He's saying, okay, actually, I have to become more Jewish, because he was from a Jewish background. So, and is Jewish, but he said he had to rediscover that, because I think evangelical theology is just so almost like so dualistic in its sense of separation of faith and works. So it's an interesting tension there.
I just can never understand any of the reasoning behind it. I mean, so much of the fear-based stuff, I can't quote anything from Trump, but I feel like it's coming from there. It definitely came from Reagan, and it has been pronounced more and more over the years, is the fear that the government or whatever higher power is coming in to control you and take your guns away. And so there is such a hard pushback against that. Like you were talking about, Ken, the other day with the pendulum,
Oh yeah.
you
Yep.
know, swinging both ways. It seems like a very scripted,
Like
fear that is created.
Justification. It's like a justification. That,
Yeah,
like,
it is scripted. I mean, there was something, I was listening to a podcast on the Nation the other day of someone talking about the afterlife of the Cold War. And this really tallies with some of the stuff I was reading and talking about in the book about the new right and the way the culture war drew on the Cold War, the demonology of the other, the communists. And this really resonated with me that Irving Kristol, she quotes, when the Cold War ends, the Berlin Wall comes down, there was this sense of who do we hate now? And she described Irving Kristol writing in a column suddenly vilifying all these government programs that had been fine until recently. But it's almost like the neural pathways are there. We've been trained in, I talk a little bit about the crucible and the whole, McCarthyism and the sort of this idea that, were you born this, you talk about squeaky clean, were you born this morning as innocent as God's fingers? That and people like William F. Buckley in the National Review, this sort of, and it is a theology, it's a kind of righteousness that we're good and they're bad. And you funnel the energies of the Cold War into hating liberals who become no different from communists. And then that enemy goes away and it's like, well, okay, Islam, but I feel like the political party and then the government itself. One of the people I quoted was Russell Kirk, who was a sort of Burkean conservative who kind of sold his soul a little bit to join Barry Goldwater's campaign, but he was a kind of old school conservative who said, look, human nature is flawed and we need the government. This modern libertarian idea of hating the government is completely un-American, unconstitutional. You won't find the founders walking around. I mean, Jefferson says some reckless things about the need for revolutions every 20 years, which is nonsense because no society can operate like that. No one else said that. This way of thinking is anarchic, really. But we saw it with COVID. We saw it with, masks suddenly became the kind of the image of the beast and all the rest of it.
Vilified by it.
Yeah. And poor Fauci, who's just some nerd who's been sitting in a lab for decades, who's getting ready to retire. And suddenly, like, everyone in the world is blasting him and hating him and thinking he's like part of a conspiracy.
Yeah.
I'm sure he's thinking, like, what happened?
Yeah, I think that's where, I found the history very, it's sobering, but also heartening to find people like Richard Hofstadter writing about this in the 1960s, talking about the paranoid style in American politics and anti-intellectualism. This demonizing of experts is something it's got a DNA. Again, it's not the American, it's not a norm, but it's a stream or a strand of American culture that has been picked up on, and social media has allowed everyone to be the expert. Two of the guys I play tennis with are kind of happen to be Delta pilots, and we have these conversations like, how would you feel if it just became this thing that anyone's qualified? I can play, it's the same sort of level of, we hate the expert, we can do it ourselves. And I feel the same, back to the issue of guns per se. There's this arrogance of thinking I'm capable of doing what this highly trained police officer or military, or soldier can do.
Right.
Yeah.
That show the restraint and all that too.
Yeah.
Like, so, we talked about that, like the sort of choosing where to point your anger or your fear or whatever, that kind of thing. Like, who's the bad guy? I think Michael Crichton has a book, State of Fear, that's basically the good guys are the bad guys in that, or vice versa. But the idea being, after the Cold War, if you don't need the government to protect you, what do you need the government for? So you need to have this, we as a society or as a class to be ruled need to have something to be afraid of. That way the government can come in or the military or, the powers that be can come in and protect us. And that gives them sort of justification through that stuff. That was a little bit of a sidebar, but I was wondering if there's anything to like the melting pot culture of America too now, where, we have like this sort of Israel-Palestine thing. And I think that you could make some comparisons there between sort of the arguments that people will latch onto. But I think it's unique because we have so many different views. And like you said, because of social media and stuff, people can be loud, right? Things that were sort of can make sort of a counterculture or a small view seem like a big view. And then somebody else can take that big view and say, see, I told you that was a big view. Listen, those crazies are coming for you, you know? And it's like, no, that guy just has a view. It's just loud. He's a louder person. You know, you don't have to watch out for him as much, but I feel like that gets manipulated to make that fear.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's definitely what happened with the Second Amendment when people came along and said, oh, it's a debate. Oh, the embarrassing Second Amendment and this whole thing. And it becomes this sort of the construction of a debate where there really wasn't one. I mean, I'm curious to know what you mean by the melting pot, because it seems that to me, a lot of this has been wrapped up in patriotism and the idea that the bad guy is probably the foreigner, if not, the foreigner within, the African American.
Right. Oh, it's the immigrants now. But again, it's like manipulating that thing to say illegal immigrants are just flooding across our border to kill us. You know, they're sending all their murderers here. When seconds count, the police will be there in a minute.
Right. Which is insane, because if you read any statistics about people coming across the border, typically they want to hide. You know, they're coming across illegally. They don't want to be sent home. So they're laying low and, just sending money back to their family. People are not coming across the border, shooting guns in the air and trying to break into your home.
No, and there's a kind of corresponding argument really about US guns are crossing the border at rates. There's a brilliant new book called Exit Wounds about the role of US guns in kind of gang violence in Mexico, and it's more than 70% of them are from the US. So it's a completely phony discourse, but occasionally, you have like that the murder that occurred on the campus of the University of Georgia a few months ago was by an undocumented immigrant, and that one case is enough to sustain the narrative for a long time. But yeah, I mean, I found it fascinating looking in the 1920s, where you get, again, it's very religious language. You get people talking about the law-abiding citizen, or then it was called the honest citizen. That slight difference of language. But the honest citizen is white, from American, Anglo-Saxon, native stock, and slow to anger. This kind of biblical language that's applied to God, like slow to anger and eminently to be trusted with arms. And then they'll say it's the foreigner behind the gun that is the source of all this violence, which is completely untrue.
Right. It's not the individual. It's never me. It's always them.
Yeah, always them.
Yeah.
Right.
It's not at a rational level. I mean, that's why I have some hope for the kind of the cultural approach. I think that, it's great to see people like Matthew McConaughey coming out and being identified with at least gun safety, if not gun control. But, I just wonder whether some of our cultural leaders could take a bit of a stand, because these arguments are just not rational. The statistics, even the history, I wrote the piece on CNN a few months ago, just basically charting stage by stage all the changes, and stand your ground laws did not exist before this century. That's a fact. I mean, there was a Supreme Court ruling that endorsed it in the 1920s, but no state had a stand your ground law. Things like permitless carry, only one state at the turn of the century, Vermont, allowed it in 1999.
Bears.
And these things.
Bears.
And people will just come and attack you and accuse you of lying. So I feel like the cultural route, the sort of cultural critique of the gun, has to at least go alongside the factual stuff. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. So 2 questions I had for you. One is, you mentioned the NRA dissolving earlier. I've read some stuff about the NRA. What's the guy's name who's been in charge of it until just recently?
Wayne LaPierre.
Yeah. I mean, he's been embezzling funds for decades and, complete mismanagement of their money. Yeah. And then, with him being removed, there is the talk of like dissolving the NRA, because who knows, it could go bankrupt. But in your studies, do you find that anyone pays attention to any of that sees this club that they stand behind, that they want to be a part of, as just this like total show?
There is an argument. So I'm digging here because there he is, Wayne LaPierre. My neighbor who was getting these delivered gives them to me, and it's time to fight. It's every single editor says the same thing. The sky's falling in. The bad guys are there. They think you're a bad guy. They don't trust you. It's the same every week. And I think that to see him fall and to see the organization shed members, we don't know the exact numbers, and to be in financial difficulty would seem like a pivotal moment, because they've just been this absolute fixture for the last 20, 30 years, in fact, for longer, but in terms of their grip on the Republican Party. But on the other hand, we've seen with things like permitless carry and assault rifles, they were playing catch up. So you've got the more radical fringe that says we need these things. You know, in the early days of the AR-15, they would be scorned when they would set up at the gun shows and at the NRA convention, and they'd be pushed to the back. And it's like, we don't want to be associated with that full-on military stuff. And then that's quickly buried. Right. So, and the same with permitless carry. They weren't at the forefront of that, but now they embrace it entirely. I don't know. I dissolve is possibly too strong a word. I think the bloom's off the rose. I mean, there's a sense of these people have been talking about being good guys. He's the one who coined that phrase. Anything that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy. You know, I think to be shown that he's been
the solution to fire is more fire. It's like, doesn't make a lot of sense.
You had said about the not having the stand your ground laws, though. Like, was that handled, do you think, common law kind of before that? Like, do we need a law, or were they just like, you know, you protected your home and we didn't need to codify it?
It wasn't written into statutory law, but there was a ruling by Oliver Wendell Holmes in Brown versus Brown, I forget which exact year, which introduced this sort of Civil War romanticism. A man's not born to run, and it's unreasonable to expect, you know, rational judgment in a moment of terror when someone's attacking you. But it wasn't actually a statutory right. People talk about stand your ground laws effectively incentivizing violence because it's better if your victim is dead.
Right, they can't sue you.
Yeah. The US right to use mortal force began to loosen in the 19th century. And it was very, very strictly controlled in the common law, in English law, because, you know, even in cases of you had a duty to retreat to safety, to a wall, to somewhere where you had nowhere to run. But even then, and this sounds so quaint, even then you weren't technically entitled to it. You had to then receive like a royal pardon. You were then, it was a sort of it was a very, very some high burden of proof. And the law enjoined tenderness of even the life of your antagonist. I mean, that sounds so quaint.
Right, yeah, sure.
But in these modern rulings, which many people just say are glib and encourage violence, it's where any person can reasonably infer mortal danger. So someone could attack me with their fists and I can think this person's strong and they could kill me and I can use lethal force. They vary according to state, but certainly in Florida, you don't need to be attacked with a gun.
Well, in Florida, they could be on bath salts. So, you know, you might be in mortal danger, you know. Right. So my second question earlier was, what's the temperature like in England? Do people stand behind this generally, culturally, or do they just look at us and think we're a bunch of Yosemite Sams?
Not at all. I mean, they don't. I mean, Patrick Charles in his book Armed in America talks about the bemusement of foreign commentators, and I think there's the assumption is that it's just part of the kind of the weird DNA of America. But again, they don't realize how rapidly the thing's changing here. There's no attempt to emulate the US here. I've noticed that newspapers like the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph, have started adopting this sort of culture war approach and really picking fights over some of the stuff that are rocking states like Tennessee and sort of trans stuff, but trying to stoke that for political advantage. But Nigel Farage, I think, wrote an article. Someone told him, I haven't seen the article. He was the leader of the Brexit movement. And I think he wrote an article saying we need to be able to have handguns. And it was just laughed at. And this is where I do get concerned when people say it's all about the money. If it were about the money, and if it were the dynamic of industrial capitalism, and I've got that excellent book by Pamela Hard on the gunning of America, where she says it's all just the creativity of advertising and ruthless capitalists, and downplaying the cultural aspect. I'm unpersuaded by that because there just isn't the cultural base. In fact, there's general revulsion. Someone told me that the British Olympic team, handgun team, was at one point practicing in France because they couldn't even keep their handguns at home in the UK. I can't kind of verify that, but there is a ferocious contempt for it, really. And there were vigorous. There was a mass shooting in Dunblane in Scotland in 1996, in which you may know the tennis player Andy Murray. That was his school. He was in primary school at the time, and it didn't take long to ban handguns completely. And Sean Connery got involved in the campaign. And I just remember this speech he made. He said that, people tell me that banning these guns is going to deprive thousands of people of innocent recreation. He says, is that more or less pleasure than watching your grandchild grow up? And it was kind of
seriously,
right.
End of story. But I think the
Yeah,
frontier
you'd think
thing
it
is
would end
also
there,
the reason
but-
I talk so much about race and certainly the legacy of slavery is that
Mhm.
frontier societies in Australia, in Canada, in many places have not developed a civilian gun culture, by which I mean a culture of personal confrontation, the right to use lethal force and self-defense. I see that as very different from a hunting culture. Hunting culture where people own long guns or rifles and don't walk around with them and don't see them primarily
Right.
as something for self-defense.
It's a lot harder to conceal a rifle.
Yes, absolutely. And lots of states have laws allowing, public carriage of weapons for hunting, but would criminalize either handguns or concealed weapons. So that's where I think the US situation is unique, and the role of slavery is unique in developing that. I mean, if you've read the book, you'll see the bit from Charles Dickens visiting the US in 1842, saying, this is just extraordinary, and we'd have to be idiots not to see the close connection between slavery and the plantations and the instant tyrannical use of force there, and then the bleeding of that out into Southern culture and into Congress, where it's Southern slaveholders who are the ones who are pulling their weapons on their Northern counterparts.
Is that the dehumanization kind of aspect in the culture?
Yeah, I mean, we were talking earlier about the sort of sheepdogs thing, and in Tim Snyder's book on tyranny, he says this is one of the marks of tyranny and of fascism is of seeing, sort of bestializing people in a literal sense. You turn people to animals. You think of them that way. There was a really interesting piece by a Jewish historian based in, I think, in Jerusalem at Hebrew University, who was talking about the tolerance in Israel for the campaign in the military action in Gaza, saying that for decades the Palestinians have been dehumanized. And we see this across the world in different contexts, but slavery was an institutionalized form of it. As Charles Sumner said, property in man. When you turn people into property, you're doing something unique that not even like the medieval forms of servitude known as villenage. My editor did not want me to include that word. It was so abstruse, but it was a brutal practice, but people were still humans under that, and they could get married and they had rights against their masters or temporary owners. Even in Tsarist Russia, the serfs were actually classified as human beings.
Right.
But the slave culture basically created its unique common law tradition that smiled at certain things and then kind of embalmed them in statutory law. But there was a sort of informal common law that said you could use mortal force on somebody, and that's what evolves into gun culture.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Wild. Taking a step back, you're clearly built for research. It seems like you enjoy it.
Nothing much else.
Yeah. What led you on that road?
Well, research in general or on guns in particular?
Say, let's take the bigger scope, the research in general.
I keep talking about my hero, one of my hero historians, E.P. Thompson, who he was the person who, if you studied history, this is one of those kind of 5 or 6 kind of iconic quotes. He says, history is about rescuing the ordinary people of the past from the enormous condescension of posterity. So these people, you think of the losers, the forgotten, the despised, that we've outgrown them. They have something to tell us. He says the past is not dead. It's actually alive with energies. It's replete and bursting with energies that can kind of inform us and challenge us. So that's the kind of history from below. He also was a famous historian activist. Like, there's a purist view. I was an undergraduate at Oxford, which has much more of a political engaged tradition. Then I did my PhD in Cambridge, which is much more the ivory tower. We study the past for its own sake.
Right.
The beauty and wonder of the past. But I always found that so unconvincing, because we're all animated by problems. We're all excited by something. We want to know what's wrong with the world. And I think that I'd much rather be honest about that. And Thompson was an anti-nuclear activist in the 80s. And he wrote these scathing or brilliant articles on, lectures on Beyond the Cold War, where he debunked the kind of Manichaean thinking that we've got to hate these people and that all Russians are Soviets, they're all communists, and we've got to grow up hating them. He just shows how interdependent we all are in profound human ways. He says, we've been fighting the other, and we need to understand that the other is us. We're just as bad.
It's us, right?
So people like Thompson just made me feel that there is something extremely powerful in the past. Like, he's about as far on the left as you can get on the political spectrum, but he's also in a funny way a conservative. Same with Martin Luther King. It's like we have a history that can be unleashed. And I found that exciting when I was an undergraduate. When I was doing my PhD, I was understanding that decline of Christianity and where it all went wrong for the church. That mattered deeply to me. Then I was a young lecturer at King's College London, and all these books came out about the new atheists of slamming religion. And I thought, well, maybe they've got a point. Maybe we could go back and look at the great unbelievers of history, including Karl Marx, including Voltaire is one of my heroes, Spinoza. And actually, I found they were believers in fascinating, unorthodox, strange ways, and that their critiques of my own Christian tradition were in many ways more Christian than the orthodoxy. And so I became their sort of heretic in their tradition. So I sort of had the groundwork, and then I got, from studying them, I got just absorbed into the whole radical political tradition, the early pioneers of democracy, the levelers. I don't know if you've heard of the English levelers, who they're the first to draft an agreement among the people. John Milton, the poet, was obviously influenced by them. This idea that just critiquing Aristotle. Aristotle's the great philosopher of hierarchy, that some people are born to govern and to rule, and some people are born to be slaves. So modernity, literally the whole political and philosophical age of modernity, is critiquing Aristotle and saying, no, everyone's created equal, everyone's created good. And this is why I love someone like Voltaire, because he just sort of trades blows with Aristotle. So yeah, I got very excited about that egalitarian tradition of philosophy. And
what was your PhD in?
My PhD was history, but I mean, it's funny, I had to dig out my certificate the other day for some temporary teaching, and it just says Doctor of Philosophy. So I'm a historian. I call myself a historian of ideas, but now people say, how dare you weigh in on these debates? I can just say, no, I'm a Doctor of Philosophy. No, yeah, I've always had a sort of leaning towards the intellectual side, but also what fascinates me is that social history, and the more, if I can use this word, the kind of the English radical tradition, the more kind of plebeian tradition of English political thought, sort of gets there a century ahead, gets to what people like Voltaire and Rousseau were saying in the 18th century, a full 100 years before, often through their religious influences or just through their kind of practical. So yeah, my favorite book, I'm looking on the shelf, is by Christopher Hill. It's called The World Turned Upside Down, The Radical Thought in the 17th Century. And they were the sort of the forerunners of democracy.
So that kind of like, when did you start writing? Because I feel like you sort of walk the line between, obviously they're very smart, but not intellectual papers. But I think you're a good writer, just to sort of break things down for idiots like me.
Just to beat up on Cambridge again, because, in Oxford, there's very much a culture of expressing yourself with flair and with passion. And you don't try and kid yourself you're this neutral, objective scholar. You just have to run with your passions and try and discipline and tame them. But I've always had that style. And then I'd get, start writing these academic articles, and one reviewer would say, great writing, love it. Another would say it's way too journalistic, colloquial, take out the colloquialisms. And I'd always refuse. It's like, I really want to express myself. So I was always seen as a sort of more of a kind of flamboyant writer and the edge of academia. And then I wrote this book, The Soul of Doubt. And everyone in that book, including Marx, even the more abstruse philosophers like Ludwig Feuerbach, Voltaire especially, they just were great wordsmiths and almost poets in many ways. And it's like, why are we as academics writing in this rebarbative jargon? The number of times now I go to a lecture and I have to listen to something 3 times over, or I have to read it 3 times over if it's an article to work out what they're saying. And I think it wasn't meant to
parse the language. To parse the language of how it's getting put together. And part of the reason, I was asking that is because I feel like obviously you're very smart and come at it from a very sort of philosophical, grounded and obviously well-researched angle.
But it's approachable.
It is. But, I feel like the people that probably need to hear your type of thought are probably the least likely to seek it out. And so
Yeah.
how do we
Yeah.
bridge that
It's a
gap?
huge problem. I think that, I've been on panels with gun owners and I've got these friends I've referred to. I think for the really committed gun owners, I do feel it's personal relationships that are primary, and it's really important to cultivate relationships beyond our political silos or whatever, our political tribes. I think in writing, a lot of people said, what have you got to say to gun owners? Well, primarily, I want to tell the truth. I want to tell the truth in an attractive way, but I think being scholarly and being accurate and having pages of footnotes and being rigorous about that does not mean you're being neutral. You can have a take, but I'm writing primarily for people who care passionately about this and want to know the truth and want to be kind of informed and empowered in a sense to see the historical arguments that might support their position. But I can't kid myself that the typical reader of these NRA magazines is actually going to read it. And
Yeah, they weren't dispersed in Cambridge.
they'll read an article on CNN and trash it. But even within the parameters of that, they're still going to misrepresent what I'm saying. But
Right.
maybe there is something that I think that the personal stuff, I think, with the chairman, the president of the African American Gun Association, lovely guy. We traveled up together from Atlanta, had a bit of a chuckle on the plane about various things, and then we were delayed massively. And I think we formed a bond. And by the end of it, I had a garbled answer to one question about how we're supposed to arm ourselves against tyranny. And I was kind of frozen from a minute. I could see he was concerned for me, and we laughed about it afterwards. I think, and then we agreed to do a talk together. Maybe we'll do a panel, which we haven't actually arranged. But I feel that we really broke through our differences. And of course, if there's any group that I'm sympathetic to in gun ownership, it's going to be African Americans who've been denied the rule of law. But, and I have these moments with my ultra right wing friends here. One of them's moved to Idaho because he thinks Georgia's too liberal now.
What?
Exactly. I think change can happen gradually through these sort of relationships. But on the writing side,
that makes sense.
I think you've got to do what you do well. And I think these books that are written by committee, where you're trying to please too many people, just lose the clarity and lose the edge. And I can't claim to, I write with an open heart in a way for the gun owner, but I've got to be honest that I think it is one of the worst things about a country that I love, and a country that's been very good to me in many ways. But I can't sugarcoat the reality of gun ownership and the falsities in which it's based historically.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this was not easy, but I mean, it was a very approachable, like I said, an insightful read that I got through pretty quickly. Like you said before, you've been on these panels where you hear something like someone speaking and you need to hear it 3 times. The average person is not going to read or listen to anything 3 times to get the point of it.
Yeah.
So your point is lost.
Yeah, I just think it should be, a book. Any book should be enjoyable. We're in the humanities. I'm not an oceanographer, a physicist, where things have to be technical. They're beyond the layperson, and then the layperson can, then you have to write a popularization. We forget that historians are storytellers, and also because for me, that book was about separating the gun from America as I see it, in America's constitutional tradition, and freedom to live and breathe and move and not live in fear. If I saw the gun as synonymous with America, as many Brits do, then I wouldn't live here. End of story. But because I wanted to bring out the Molly Ivanses of this world, bring out the better side of the constitutional history, it's the story of hope. So I want it to be enjoyable. I wanted to be able to tell the better side, the side of people who have transcended these myths and they've spoken through them. Adam Ballou, this is a random example, but he was a peace activist in the Civil War, at which point even Quakers, most pacifists renounced their pacifism because they were so excited at the prospect of abolishing slavery that they abandoned their pacifism. And so the pacifist movement pretty much dies. And Adam Ballou writes in one of his books, he says, look, I'm writing this for the future because I know, this is just seed money, because I know the time's not propitious. But there is going to come a time where people read this book. And who picks it up but Leo Tolstoy? Leo Tolstoy picks up, finds Ballou, corresponds with William Lloyd Garrison's son, and says, who'd have known that this wealth of literature existed in America? And it underpins his whole critique of the idolatry of arms. It's picked up by Gandhi famously, and then it comes back to the US really through Martin Luther King and his whole, the whole civil rights movement. So that kind of excites me. Not that I want to just say no one's going to read my book in my lifetime, but as a historian, you have that kind of hope in a way that,
right.
You could just be contributing at the start of something.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a good objective viewpoint. It's not weighing too heavily. It was just, here's the facts. It's well researched. It's very believable. And it just shines a light on so many issues that, I mean, one that I feel passionately about, but there were so many things in there that I wasn't even aware of.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's amazing the stuff that is just buried and forgotten. How, the fact that there was a huge debate in the 1960s and the Washington Post was having like more than 100 consecutive editorials on gun violence in 1 year. And these are treasures to me, even though that was a battle that was basically lost. They're treasures because it's so quickly forgotten. Most people, even now, like liberal journalists, don't know about the Heller decision and how new that is. So yeah, on the prosaic level, a lot of it is just you're saying, look, here's this stuff. Here's what people were saying. Like Nixon wanted to ban handguns. That's a fact. It's documented. So yeah, some of it's just at that level.
All right.
Usually this is a little less topical and a little more about the individual. And so we like to hear about where the individual has come from. The question is, where do you call home? And if you were playing tour guide for a day, if we came to visit, what are we doing?
Like just to know you.
It's funny.
Dominic
I've been thinking about this a lot
version.
because not just in relation to being a guest on your podcast, but I was away at boarding school as a kid, and I was taught by Benedictine monks in North Yorkshire. And I was just thinking yesterday as I was walking through the neighborhood, and I do think of this as home now, and it is literally my home. But I was thinking, because we went away to school and we saw our parents, weekends during the terms, but only for longer periods in the holidays, it has a strange uprooting quality that for me, the real home is like the Lake District in the Northwest, where I spent many of my summers, and my closest friend in England still lives. So when I go back in the summer, I consider the Lake District, where I had my kind of great times in the summers and kind of jumping into lakes and climbing mountains, probably not what Americans would consider actual mountains, but rocky knobbles in the landscape. I see that as, I mean, it's a heavily romanticized landscape because it's, you've got all the poets and Wordsworth. I feel like home for me is like playing cricket in the summer. This is going to sound very romantic. I've been working a lot on nationalism recently and patriotism, and George Orwell's got this hilarious thing about how you should love the place you grew up. You shouldn't be proud about it, but English people love flowers, okay? That's just... English people are gardeners above all. Watching it, a friend of mine from the US was staying with my parents a few years back, and we went from watching Gardener's Questions... Gardener's World. Gardener's Question Time is on the radio, the Gardener's World on the BBC, to watching Stormzy performing at Glastonbury. And he just thought this incongruity was absolutely hilarious. But for me, gardening, Lake District and cricket, even though I stopped playing a few years back and I actually played more tennis, cricket is home. And what I loved about it was just everyone in the neighborhood, different skill levels, and it's very kind of socially mixed. And I think that's one of the better things. And I think, I mean, as much as I love this and I find it dynamic, and I think it's much more a much more open culture. There isn't a class thing at all. I do a lot of yard stuff and DIY stuff, and in the UK, people roll their eyeballs. They hear your accent. My accent identifies me as being posh, upper middle class, and they think, who's this dilettante you think he is? And they'll be rude to you. Here, it's just like, hey, what are you working on? And great. And where are you from? And that's the kind of thing that makes me feel much more at home here.
That's cool.
That's interesting. I hadn't thought of that. So, okay, that's a good answer. If we're back in England, we're gardening, we're playing cricket in the afternoon, swimming in a lake. In Atlanta, where are you taking someone for a few hours?
I think we're doing a tour of the botanical gardens. They sound so middle-aged, I know, but I got to the point where I am more interested in trees than in, say, what the English football team's doing in the Euros or whatever. And my children will laugh at me for taking certain routes, driving certain routes to see certain ginkgo trees or dawn redwoods. And so that's kind of my personal obsession. But that's why living in a place like Atlanta, people come, they've been here for conferences and just think it's some kind of concrete jungle. Then they come into our neighborhoods. And it's like, you really are living in almost in the countryside. So that's a great thing about Atlanta.
Yeah, I've
Botanical
spent a lot of time
gardens.
there for work, and I usually go on runs like when I'm traveling. So it's a great way to see
Oh, yeah,
places, and I've gone through all of
Do you know
those
the
neighborhoods.
Beltline?
Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah, that's one of the great things. Yeah, that's what we'd be doing. We'd be looking at trees, then go down the Beltline and have lunch somewhere. But so next time, please do look me up.
We'll
Oh,
do that.
yeah, I'd be glad to.
Is there a restaurant where is there a specific place you'd be
Yeah,
like, you know
there's a
what, we'll
great, I
hit-
forget the name. There's a great Japanese restaurant in Pond City Market, which is the old Sears. Sears.
I love that place.
Yeah, there are some good places down there. And then right at the end, and Croke Street Market is another converted building. So I mean, the Beltline's great, but when it started, you still had these great views of the skyline, the city. Now it's all built up, and it feels more like a tunnel. But still, it's a brilliant project.
Yeah, Ken, have you been there?
Yeah. So yeah, I went down there for Comcast is one of our big clients and all that.
Oh yeah. Did you go to Ponch City?
No, I don't think we did. It was a while back.
It's like our house on steroids.
Oh, is it really? Oh man, I love our
Yeah,
house.
super nice.
But it was a lot hillier than I expected. I don't know what I was
As a
expecting,
cyclist,
but I'm like, I went
imagine.
for a run. I'm like,
You don't
God,
realize it
like,
until you run, or in my case, cycle. It's a very hilly city.
Oh, nice.
up and down. Geez. Yeah, we have the community. Aaron and I live in the same community, but it's many hills like that. So if you can bike or you can run through our community, you're going to be fine, like wherever you go.
Yeah.
But it doesn't make it any less. It doesn't make it any more pleasant. Put it that way.
Cool. Well,
Very cool.
I think our time is just about up. We don't want to hold you all afternoon.
Yeah, this is
This
really
was a
great.
great conversation.
Thanks
Thank
very
you.
much.
I really appreciate
sorry,
you joining
a bit
us.
rambling at times, but I really enjoyed talking, and yeah, well,
Yeah,
No, it's the stuff I
that's
wanted
good.
to hear. I feel a little bit smarter. So.
Yeah, I was gonna say we're kind of like idiots, so I was like, I don't feel as dumb as I thought I might feel, so I feel good about that.
All right.
well, thanks very much, and yeah, give me a shout when you're in Atlanta.
Awesome.
Absolutely.
Great
Cool.
time.
Take care.
Thank you, Dominic.
Bye.
Have a great
Have a good
day.
afternoon.
You too.
Bye.